Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. Welcome and Jazakallah khair for coming here tonight. We're honored to have an esteemed panel of very knowledgeable and experienced people amongst us tonight. Shaykh Faraz Rabbani, founder of Seekers Hub. Kimberly Miller from the Ontario Council for Adoption. Michael Blugerman, a private adoption practitioner. They're all here with us tonight, and their biography is all in your folders. So if you look into your folders, you'll find them. A little bit about us. Sarah and I, she's at the back there in the blue and green hijab. Sarah and I started Amal Fertility because we felt there was a need to support women and families who are experiencing infertility. We wanted to start a conversation around subjects like infertility and adoption that are either misunderstood or not talked about enough in our community, hence today's seminar. Before we begin, I would like to bring a couple of things to your attention. If you look into your folder, you'll find a pen and an index card. If you have any questions, please write them down on the card and place them in the box. It's at the registration table. Sarah's lifting it up for us so you can take a look. It says Q&A right on top. And for your convenience, the box will be passed around halfway through so we can collect your questions for you if you cannot make it back to the registration table. All questions will be taken at the end of the seminar. Out of respect for our panel and each other, I'd like to ask you to check your phones, put them on silent or turn them off, inshallah. And Shaykh Rabbani is the founder of Seekers Hub. He has traveled to Damascus and Amman in search for knowledge. He has been, in 2009 and 2012, named one of the 500 most influential Muslims by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center. Please welcome Shaykh Rabbani. So, Shaykh Rabbani, there are many misconceptions regarding Islam and adoption in our community. Can we start off with answering some of these questions? One of those questions is, well, why is adoption so important?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Why is adoption so important? Really, if you look at what the purpose of religion itself is, right? What's the purpose of religion? And like, why has Allah given us religious guidance? Right? They say all of it summarizes back to two principles, right? Which is the preservation of benefit and the prevention of harm. Jalbul masalih wa daf'ul mafasid. That the preservation of benefit and the prevention of harm for oneself and for others. None of you believes until they wish for others of the good that they wish for themselves. That's the whole purpose of religion. How do you preserve benefit for yourself and for all God's creation? And how do you prevent harm from yourself and from all God's creation? So that is the very purpose of religion. And so any situation in which we see that there is harm, right? There is harm, right? We can assume, even without looking at religious guidance, that this is an undesirable situation. And one of the situations of harm is when there's, and one of the most pressing is when when there's a child who is not, for whatever the circumstances, being cared for, whether they're an orphan or whether they are in other situations where they are not properly cared for. Which is why one of the most oft repeated categories of virtue mentioned in the Quran and in the prophetic tradition is taking care of an orphan. There's over 30 verses in the Quran that talk about the yatim, the orphan, or the orphans. Right? And when it talks about those who turn away from religion, one of the first descriptions of, if you look in Surah Al-Ma'un, for example, is that they neglect the orphan. That they neglect the orphan. And it, of course, does not only refer to the orphan. There would be those who are akin to the orphan in being in a situation of neglect or distress or hardship. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, relates to the person themselves, and they're wishing to take care of a child, and that benefit or that situation where one feels a situation of personal harm, right, or the opportunity of good, that door is open. There's, of course, a great divine wisdom why the final prophet of Allah, our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was himself an orphan. And in Surah Al-Duha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds of this. أَلَمْ يَجِدِكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى. Did he not find you an orphan and grant you shelter? Right? Did Allah not find you an orphan and grant you shelter and protection? And there's a great divine wisdom that it is a sunnah of Allah to take care of orphans. Right? The final prophet was sent as an orphan for many wisdoms which you can investigate, but also to highlight the importance of taking care of orphans. And the Prophet ﷺ himself adopted. Right? He had adopted Zayd ibn al-Haritha, who initially was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad, but then was referred to by his birth lineage, Zayd ibn al-Haritha, but the Prophet ﷺ continued to refer to him as his son. Right? And that's, of course, and there's many other instances of the Prophet ﷺ taking on children and caring for them and encouraging the taking care of orphans and those neglected in so many ways. So this is really one of the greatest of virtues that one can pursue, is to take care of an orphan. There is a misconception, and we're going to base this on having questions and answers and the questions you have, but there's a big misconception that because Islam does not allow you to claim another child as your own, that this means that Islam does not permit abortion, adoption. Sorry, I spend all my day answering legal questions. Sorry, sometimes the wires get mixed. Why Islam does not allow adoption, right? And the problem is it's a matter of terminology. But if by adoption you mean making the child legally your own, such that you deny the fact that they have other biological parents, that's a legal issue. But if by adoption you consider the fact that you have taken on the responsibility for the care and upbringing and well-being of this child, then this is one of the greatest of virtues. However, our religion teaches balance, that just as you have this opportunity to do good, okay, and to fulfill that desire to raise a child, the opportunity to raise the child, the responsibility, because it's a collective obligation for us as a community and for us as human beings to be taking care of orphans. It's a collective responsibility. But the child has rights, and amongst the rights of the child is, when the time is right for them, to know who their actual parents are, right? And to keep that balance. But this balance is sometimes lost, because when some people refer to certain legal texts or certain texts from the Quran, they look at it from a very narrow perspective. So there's texts in the Quran, but do not refer to them as your children. Right? But this is not in the sense that you cannot call someone my child. It's in the sense of you cannot claim them to be your child in a legal sense. In a legal sense. Because otherwise we know, and it's in the Tarikh al-Kabir of Imam al-Bukhari, for example, one of the companions who was relatively younger, he lost his father in one of the battles with the Prophet ﷺ. And this child was, this young man, he was not an infant, he was a young man. He was distraught, he lost his father. So he said, the Prophet ﷺ went up to him and asked him, what makes you cry? He said, I lost my father. And the Prophet consoled him, and then after he said, would it not grant you some contentment that for me to be your father and for Aisha to be your mother? And this young man smiled. Right? This young man smiled because you know that, and the Prophet ﷺ would then take care of him as one would take care of a child. That was one's own. Right? So it's not a matter of, you know, sometimes we distinguish between our legal tradition and how we conduct ourselves. Right? Like if you go to see your neighbor, you wouldn't go and say, by the way, as my neighbor, these are your rights, these are my rights. And I'm planting a tree when the tree grows. And there's actually, it's kind of interesting because there's a lot of religious law related to the boundary between neighbors. It actually gets very tricky in law as well. Because if you have a tree that overhangs into your neighbor, who does the fruit belong to? All these things. And in every legal system, there's a lot of, actually there's bylaws in many places regarding fruit trees and where the fruit falls, etc., because it leads to dispute. But when you go and introduce yourself to your neighbor, you wouldn't build your relationship on the basis of this legalism. You take care of the law, but you take care of it in a positive manner, not in a legalistic manner. So sometimes these problems arise that cause people not to want to adopt. Rather, religiously, it is very clear from the Quran, with the emphasis in the Quran on adoption, on taking care of orphans. From the prophetic practice himself, one by the divine honoring of the Prophet ﷺ by making him an orphan, by the prophetic encouragement to adopt. The Prophet ﷺ said, the one who takes care of an orphan, the one who takes guardianship or fosterage of an orphan, and I will be like these two in paradise. And he brought two fingers next to each other. That this is one of the means for the highest ranks in paradise is to raise an orphan child oneself. And numerous, that if one wants to be guaranteed paradise, then take care of, feed, and provide for, and educate an orphan. If you want to be guaranteed paradise, do this. So this is a high encouragement, but there are religious guidelines to follow. And there's many wisdoms in them. Amongst them is to maintain that balance between what is in the best interests of the child and the interests of those who are taking care of the child, and also the rights of actual parents if they're alive, right? So to keep all that in rightful balance. So but those guidelines, and a lot of people have questions. So I'm not going to say much more than this as a precursor, but in sum, one of the most virtuous acts that you can engage in is to take the guardianship, to adopt a child, and to raise them well. And the sunnah in that is to raise them as one's own child, to raise them as one's own child, right? And there are many misconceptions regarding that you can't refer to them as your own son. You can, the Prophet ﷺ referred to many. Sayyidina Anas ibn Malik, who when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, came to Medina, his mother gave Sayyidina Anas in service to the Prophet ﷺ. So he lived with his parents, but he spent the whole day with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he would basically spend the whole day learning from the Prophet and trying to serve him. And it was very interesting because he'd mess up quite frequently. He was only 10 when so he said, whenever I broke something, not if I broke something, whenever I broke something, he'd never get upset with me. But the Prophet ﷺ frequently referred to him as my son, my dear son, ya ibni, ya bunay, or my dear little son. Right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Many other misconceptions as well. So what we're going to do is Sister Fatima has some questions to open up the discussion. And please do ask the questions you have, the concerns regarding the religious guidelines related to that. But ultimately, it's one of the maqasid of the Sharia, one of the aims of religious guidance, to encourage people to take care individually and collectively of orphans, and to remove the barriers between the fulfillment. The biggest concern in it is the well-being of a child. The well-being of a child who does not have proper care. But there's secondary considerations as well of having that religious opportunity to raise a child or to raise another child. Right? So if one has that inclination, one should make the intention to go ahead and adopt, and then just be clear on what the guidelines and parameters are of doing so in a rightful way.
Okay, that clears up some misconceptions, but let's talk about kafala and how it's different from adoption.
Yeah. So the kafala, which can be translated as guardianship or fosterage, perhaps, terms are loaded. Right? Terms are loaded, right? And very often, Imam Ghazali says people very often get lost in terms and forget meanings. Right? Get lost in terms and forget meanings. Right? So kafala is to undertake the care of another, basically. Right? To undertake the care of another. I don't want to commit to a particular term because these have different legal implications in law. So kafala is basically a type of adoption in which a party takes on the responsibility, whether voluntarily or formally, to be responsible for the upbringing of a child. Where it differs from formal legal adoption in some potential aspects of legal adoption, because legal adoption does not necessarily entail all these things. In legal adoption, you don't have to pretend that they're your biological child, for example, right? There's sometimes that, if I adopt them, I'm claiming that they're my biological. That's not, that's not the case, as the rest of the panel will make clear in due time. But there's a few guiding considerations. One is that you are responsible for the child. You raise them as a parent, but you are not considered their biological parent, right? And when the time is right, certainly once they're mature, before they become a mature adult, they have to, they should be informed of their parents, and one should not claim biological lineage that they're your biological children. This does not, of course, mean that you cannot give them your last name. Last names, Islamically, are up to you. If I decided, for a while there's an Afghani warlord named General Rabbani or something. So let's say I didn't want that association. I wanted to change my name to, let's say, Faraz Shaykh. I can. Now, if I claim to be, her son or something, that's a problem, right? That one is just absurd. Number two, it's not true, and then there's implications, right? But even having the last name, you can call yourself whatever you want, unless you claim, legal lineage, etc., that's a separate matter. And there's wisdoms underlying that. But sometimes for practical purposes, that I know I have, my wife never changed her last name, but I know people in my family who are much more on the women's rights bandwagon, but who changed their name. I said, why do you change your name? They changed when they got married. I said, it's much more practical. They travel a lot in many parts of the world where if you get a hotel room, if the man and the woman have different last names, people look at you funny or suspect or this or that. And there's nothing. Are you claiming? No, right? You're not denying paternity or lineage to your own parents, etc. So some of these things are misgiving. So those are two. The third is with respect to inheritance, because if inheritance is through lineage, right, is only for immediate biological family, then the adopted child does not inherit. But this is also a legal formality in that that child is eligible for your will, right? Because your inheritance is divided into that which is discretionary, which is your will, which is your bequest, right? And that which is already legally defined Islamically, which you don't have a choice over. You can't choose how much each of your biological children would get. But the scholars say if you raise a child, especially from infancy, etc., and they grow up with you, etc., then it is highly encouraged that you should make them part of your will and specify for them that an equitable or a fair amount, and it's up to your discretion. It is up to your discretion. So these are some of the broad guidelines that you don't claim lineage, you don't deny their actual parentage. They don't inherit from you, but you can specify. But that is the automatic inheritance, right? But it is highly encouraged for you to include them in your will, particularly if they grew up with you, etc. So those are some of the broad criteria. There are some, because they're not considered biologically to be your own children, there are some issues related to matters of interaction, but we'll take those in the questions, inshallah.
Leading into that next question there, so the mahram guidelines are a source of hesitation for some people when it comes to adoption. How could something like that be practically implemented in a Muslim household having adopted a child or children?
Again, they say that قَلِيلُ عِلْمٍ أَضَرُّ مِنْ كَثِيرِ جَهْلٍ, that sometimes a little knowledge is more harmful than a lot of ignorance. If you really don't know, you won't worry about anything and just go on with things. You know a little bit, you'll be really confused, and you'll cause a bit of a mess. So firstly, there are no limits to gender interaction between an adult and a small child, except insofar as certain precautionary guidelines in terms of so to avoid abusive situations, etc. But a man and a young girl, a woman and a young boy, none of the limits of gender interaction apply in those cases until they are close to or reach adulthood, right? Upon puberty, right? Until then, it's not an issue to begin with. Until then, it is not an issue to begin with. When it comes to, for example, hijab, physical contact, and being alone together, etc., those limits do not apply until puberty or close to it, right? So that's one aspect. The other aspect related. So even if one adopts after the period of nursing, it is not an issue. There are ways around it as well. If someone already has children, the issue of being alone with another person, right, who is an adult, called khalwa, right, where for two people to be alone in an enclosed space, right? that only arises again if the child is an adult of the opposite sex. But there are many things around that. The first is you don't have to adopt only one child. You could adopt more than one child. That's one aspect, right? If you don't already have children of your own, for example, right? There are other ways around it as well. Legally, it is not considered to be khalwa, it's not considered to be seclusion unless you're in an enclosed space alone without a third party anywhere around, right? So for you to be in the same house, you're there in the kitchen, you're in the living room, etc., there's no one else in the house, that is not in itself a problem. Right? That's not in itself a problem. So there are discrete ways of going around those considerations, and they do have, they do have their wisdoms, right? So so in some the rules related to gender interaction, they only arise fully when the child reaches adulthood. The issue of khalwa, being alone, only arises if you're in a closed room together, alone, right? Unless, of course, there's fear of the inappropriate whatever, like that's a separate kind of situation. But in the general case, just don't shut the door of their bedroom alone with them, right? But if they're in the living room, you're in the dining room, you're in an open space, etc., that issue does not arise. And then there's levels of comfort there. If one wants to keep away from the whole issue, one can adopt more than one child, right? Which avoid, there's many ways to deal with those issues as well.
Okay. Jazakallah khair for that. Some people feel that maybe nursing them and making them into their mahram would be a viable way of going about that. What are the guidelines regarding nursing? I think it's called radat.
So nursing is one way of establishing a kind of parental relationship, but again, it does not make them your child, right? It used to be a common practice that people, for many reasons, one, because it's not easy for everyone to nurse, so people would and one for facilitation, number two also to strengthen ties between families. They would have people nurse their child, and that would establish another type of relationship. So you have a mother and father, and you also have a mother through nursing, right? So to establish another relationship. And given the closeness of that relationship, you cannot marry the family of your mother through nursing, etc. Certain, and that person, the person who nursed you, is like unmarriageable family in the sense that the rules of covering, etc., do not apply to them. However, the issue of adoption is separate from the issue of nursing. Right? Many people think the only way you can quote unquote adopt a child is if you nurse them before the age of 2. There's a number of positions within Islam, 2, 2.5, or 3, right? Within the age of nursing, which there's a few positions on. But that's not the case. Adoption is separate from the issue of nursing. That is one possibility. But many people adopt for the very reason that they can either not have children, or they can no longer have children, etc. So where would nursing come into the equation? So the two legally are two completely separate issues. That is one potential avenue, but it practically does not arise. Because if you adopt a child from the age of 1 or 2 until they're 12 or older, none of the gender interaction issues arise anyways, directly, right? So that's not, so it's not really an issue.
Right now, I think one of the misconceptions is an infant. Infants are in abundance somehow, and 0 to 2 is available readily. And of course, we know that it doesn't work that way. A lot of older children are in need of adoptive care. As a community, what is our responsibility towards these children, whether they be Muslim or non-Muslim?
There's, I mean, Islam, in Islam, we have two levels of obligation. We have personal obligations, which apply to every single person. You know, the obligation to believe, the obligation to pray, to give the obligatory charity, zakat, etc., to fast Ramadan. And there's other things that are personally obligatory, to do that which is permissible, to avoid the prohibited. These are personal obligations. But we also have an important and often neglected aspect of our personal obligation, which is the idea of the fard al-kifaya, collective or social obligations. Right? And everything that preserves good or prevents harm in creation falls under one aspect of our collective or social obligations. Right? So the fact that there are chickens being raised in, through factory farming, and that is of detriment to the chicken, it's not being in just some kind of hippie or something to say, I'm worried about that. Every harm is to be prevented. Right? Now, you can't possibly do all of it. That's a collective obligation. We have to have concern for all good and prevention, and for the prevention of all harm from all of creation. And those who are at the greatest injustice or harm, those are the areas of greatest responsibility. And as is clear in the Quran, one of the areas of grave responsibility in that is the child that is orphaned or legal, or someone who's akin to an orphanage situation. A child from abusive parents, for example. So they've been taken away from their parents because of an abusive situation or whatever. In these,
Referring to foster care.
in foster care, I keep away from terms just for the sake, because people get caught up. Okay, adoption versus foster care versus guardian, and they get lost in terms. But any case where there's harm on someone who's particularly vulnerable, that is a case where we have to be particularly concerned for that to be taken care of. Whether you do it directly or indirectly through facilitating the material support. So to be supporting that as a community is an obligation. So a project such as Amal, for example, is trying to fulfill part of our collective responsibility as Muslims with respect to this. And even if you're not adopting, one of the ways to express one's concern is to be supporting such initiatives, right? But these are collective obligations, right? The more directly you take on one of these social obligations, the greater the reward and the greater the fulfillment of your social responsibility as a believer. So for you to raise an orphan yourself and to go through all that requires, that is particularly meritorious. But for you to be funding it. So for example, they could be parents who could raise the child, but they can't afford to pay for the costs. But for us to say, okay, how do we develop institutional circumstances where we could be facilitating for their upbringing, where there may be others who could be very capable in raising them in whatever circumstances, that is also very meritorious. And that's not limited to age. There's nothing in the Quran nor in prophetic teaching saying that raise an orphan who's a child, who's a baby, right? Anyone who's in that situation, until they're an adult, there's tremendous merit in it. There's undeniably tremendous merit in it. And sometimes how do you assess what need should you fulfill? Where is the greatest harm? Right? So if the greatest unfulfilled need is for children between 6 and 10, for example. Okay. For you to fulfill the greater unfulfilled need is of greater merit than to fulfill the lesser need, if you are able to, right? If you're able to. And it also could depend on your own circumstances. So one shouldn't hold back from those kinds of circumstances.
One last question for you, Shaykh. We've heard of the rights and responsibilities of the adoptive parents or the person willing to take care of the adopted children, what is the responsibility of the adopted children towards their adoptive parents?
That's a good question. The jurists tend to be, the fuqaha tend to be rather pessimistic and about in their view of humanity. And I thought, like, come on, guys, chill out. But the reality is that it's like, you know, like if you go talk to a lawyer about what people do. They'll say, people don't fulfill their contracts, you know, because they deal with that all the time. Right? They deal with the bad scenarios. No one goes to a lawyer to celebrate. Could you write a declaration of successful fulfillment of this contract? No, you deal with the borderline cases. The problem with one of the realities of raising a child in general is most children are not grateful. Most of us are not sufficiently grateful to our parents. Right? That's a reality. Right? And even though they are our own parents, raising, you know, adoption is more complicated than just straight up parenting. Right? There's many potentially complicating factors. And it is often the case that with those complications, the adopted child may feel it could complicate their relationship with their adoptive parent. But what we see clearly in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is one should treat one's adoptive parents as one's own parents. And one of the beautiful examples of that is the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, himself with Abu Talib. Abu Talib, his uncle, treated the Prophet ﷺ as his son. So much so that when Quraysh, you know, the Meccans came, they tried to negotiate with Abu Talib. They said, look, why don't we give you one of our sons and you give us your son? And he was technically the nephew of Abu Talib. And he said, you really want me to take one of your sons so I can take good care of him, and you take my son for you to harm him? Am I mad? Right? But if you look at that stage of the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, when his uncle passed away, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was in incredible sorrow. The year in which Abu Talib and his wife Khadija passed away, it's called the year of sorrow, Amul Huzn, because the Prophet ﷺ felt it as one would feel the loss of one's own parents, right? And we see very clearly from that one treats them as one would treat one's parents in terms of respect and gratitude and maintaining ties, etc. So one treats them as one's parent, and if they're needy, you know, if someone does good to you, what do? It is basic ethic of our religion that you reciprocate and strive to do it in that which is better. So someone raised you as a child, then you have a moral responsibility to continue to be appreciative and to take care of them if they ever have any need.
Thank you, Shaykh Rabbani. Jazakallah khair for shedding light on these pressing issues regarding adoption in Islam. To the audience, if you have any questions for Shaykh Rabbani, please write them down on the index cards, and either you can drop them off at the back or they'll be collected from you, inshallah. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Miller. Kimberly Miller, again, is from the Adoption Council of Ontario. Kimberly has extensive experience in the field of adoption, both on a professional and on a personal level. She will be giving us an overview of how to become eligible to adopt in Ontario.
Do you want to put that on?
Yeah, sure.
Because I'll forget. Yeah, is that okay? Put that there. Thank you. And I'll try not to stand in front of it. I could probably speak without the mic, but I will use the mic. Thank you. I'll try to. I'll try to
I can
remember
bring
anyway.
the,
Sure. I can't
it's
believe
a
the
little easier.
I can't believe the turnout. This is amazing. There we go. Okay. That was amazing, actually, to hear, because I could just listen to you all night, because the messages are very similar. In terms of the clinical work that we do in adoption, the messages are there in terms of keeping the past alive and the connection to present alive. So I always talk about adoption as a marriage between the past and the present. And both need to be cared and respected in order to have a healthy relationship. So I'm going to do the how to adopt stuff. But you have a lot of information in your package already. So this really is a compacted version of the how to adopt that we do. Usually it's an hour-long session, so I've scrunched as much together as I possibly could for you. And I would encourage you to continue to do your own research, to reach out, to talk to people, connect with people, and take as much information as you possibly can. And if you have any questions at all, please connect with us. Okay? So this is the how-to, basically. I'm going to go through briefly the home study process, the PRIDE, which stands for Parent Resource Information Development and Education. I always get it wrong, but I got it right this time. So it's a course, basically, for prospective adoptive parents. And when we use the word adoption, more and more we're using the word permanence, because there is different types of families. And really what we are looking for is children have permanence in their life. So they have stability, they have someone that they can go to in their life. That is their solid, that's their person. Sometimes it's legally through adoption, but there are other avenues to provide that for children. So we look at step-parent adoptions, we look at guardianship, we look at kinship as well, adoptions, and then there's guardianship and customary care as well. So there's different ways to adopt, not necessarily adoption is a legal term, but it's a broader term than that. So we'll look at openness, and that is really a huge area right now. Openness really means the connection between birth family and the adopted child or youth. And we'll look at possible next steps, and we'll look at the different avenues of adoption. Alrighty, so you can see the definition there. Really, it is a legal term, but we look at it much more than that, than just the legalities of it. So who can adopt? There's no parameters in terms of age, so anybody, any age. Some agencies like to have guidelines in terms of not having more than 40 years between a child and a parent. And that is because they've often been through many losses already. And so to have them go through more losses, such as the loss of a parent who's adopted them, may be more challenging for them. So some people do have guidelines on age in terms of the age span or age difference. Cultural considerations, so most agencies like to really honor that for a child. And often if you're looking at a birth parent who is giving their requests, their wishes for their child, they will often give many requests, and agencies try to honor that as much as they possibly can. Sometimes they can't. And rather than have a child wait for a family, they try to find families who will honor that and will cherish that and will accept and bring it into their life, even if they are not the same. And then the last one is marital status and sexual orientation. There is no parameters around that. So you don't have to be married, you don't have to be legally married, you could be single, you can be in many different situations, and they will look at you in terms of what you can offer a child in terms of stability and permanence for them. So these are some of the great qualities of adoptive families that we find. Now, I'm sure that our family will say that some days some of them are more challenging than others, but generally these are the things that are helpful for parents to look at when they're looking at adopting children. Some children come with some needs, and certainly, looking at how you maintain connections for a child through their birth family, they may come with many challenges. There are children with special needs that also need families, and they need families probably more than children without special needs. So we need to look at those kids as well. And you know, even if you give birth to a child, you never know what may come. You never know what that child is going to need until they're actually here. And so often we don't know all the needs that a child may have until they're a certain age. You know, they're in school, we realize they might have some educational challenges. There might be other things that they need attention, but that happens with many children. It's not specific to adopted children. So there's the three main types of adoption. There's public adoption, and that would be through a Children's Aid Society. So that would be a child who's made a Crown Ward, whose parents' rights have been severed by the courts. And they are then available for adoption and would need a permanent family. The next one is a private adoption, so a birth parent who is looking to plan for their child and looking for a family privately, not going through a Children's Aid Society, meaning there is no protection concerns, no necessarily abuse or neglect. They just simply are not able to parent their child and need to plan for that child. And the next one is international adoption, so children from around the world also need families. And then the last are just some other options available in terms of adoption that we're looking at more and more, and we also support these families at the Adoption Council of Ontario. So these are the requirements, and some of them are in your package. So there's our information, brief information about them. So the Safe Home Study. So this is a quite extensive process, I would say. And really, when I would do these with families, I would let them know if I was giving my child to a family, I would want no stone unturned. I would want to make sure that my child was safe, that they were going to be happy, healthy, and have all the things that I would want them to have. So sometimes it can feel like a lot of work, and it is a lot of work. It's a lot of emotional work. It's interviews, it's people coming into your home, it's paperwork. It's really divulging a lot about yourself and who you are. But the purpose of that is to make sure that children are safe and to really make the best possible match possible for that child, to make sure that whatever that child may need along the way, that family is going to be able to do that for them. The next is the PRIDE training, and that's often done in conjunction with the home study. So that is generally 27 hours, so it's like a 9-week course, so one night a week for 3 hours. So consider this like pre-PRIDE kind of thing, your 3 hours. Sometimes you can take this through a Children's Aid Society, or you can take it privately. There's private practitioners that will offer that as well. Sometimes they will chunk the times together. So it might be a Saturday and Sunday this weekend, and then next weekend another Saturday and Sunday, and you get your 27 hours done all at once. And then portability is the last issue. So whether you have a home study done by a private practitioner or through a Children's Aid Society, you're supposed to be able to use them between one and the other. Now this is in theory, and it's easier said than done. So there's different rules about it, and you'll need to understand that a Children's Aid Society home study could not be used for an international adoption, but a private home study could be used for a Children's Aid Society adoption. So if you want to know more about that, I'm happy to chat about it along the way. You don't need it right away, but you will want to look into it at some point. So this is the SAFE home study. So the structured analysis family evaluation. It's a big fancy word for we want to get to know who you are, where you come from, how you were raised, are you healthy, can you financially look after yourself, what do your family and friends think of you, what are your good qualities, what might some of your challenges be, and it's done through a series of interviews with a adoption practitioner or a Children's Aid Society worker. It's generally 4 to 6 interviews, usually in the office or in your home. And then along with those interviews goes a lot of paperwork, and we'll look at some of those as well. So everyone has to have a home study done. So you can't just say, yep, I've had people phone and say, yep, I would like those 2 kids. It's like, well, you have to go through this process first. So it's not just about love, it's making sure that all these steps are done, which can be challenging sometimes, but they're all necessary and needed. So those are just the few of the steps up there. At the end of it, each agency has a different sort of take on whether you can take your home study with you, or whether if it's a Children's Aid Society, they often hold on to your home study. They will send it to other Children's Aid Societies for you if that's what you need to do. But private practitioners will give you your home study, and you can do what you want with it. So you can take it to other Children's Aid Societies throughout the province if you would like to. So this is the written report. So everybody has to do one, as I said earlier. These are some of the documents that go along with the safe home study. So there's the police check. Sometimes there's international police checks, depending on whether it's you've lived elsewhere. There's child welfare checks. So that means that they don't just do a police check, they also check with Children's Aid Societies to see if you've ever had a home study done before, if there's ever been a report on you or somebody in your home, in every place that you've lived since the age of 18. They right away. So it can be a lengthy process to make sure that all of those documents are completed. The next one, financial statements. You don't have to be rich to adopt, certainly not. But they do need to make sure that you're able to care for a child. So, and some children do actually come if they have a special need through a Children's Aid Society. They may come with a subsidy as well in terms of helping you meet some of those needs. So say there was a child that had significant medical needs that needed something that your benefits couldn't cover, that may be a child where a subsidy could be put in place to help you care for that child. So once you do a home study, you do it once. You don't have to do all of that all over again. But there are certain things that run out. So your police check and your medicals and things like that are good for a couple of years. And then if a child hasn't been placed in your home in that time, then those things would need to be updated. But home studies generally take 6 to 12 months, depending on where you have it done and what agency does it and what their workload issues are. So generally, if a child is not placed, fairly soon after your home study is done, you may have to update some of these paperwork again. And if there was any fee to that, like paying for a doctor to write the report or to sign it, then that would be something that you would cover. But generally, through Children's Aid Societies, there's not a lot of cost to have your home study done. So there's the adoption practitioner. So you could also have a private practitioner do this. So the website is at the bottom, and they're all licensed through the ministry, and they're across the province. And so then they charge to have the same kind of home study done that a Children's Aid Society would do. A Children's Aid would do it for free, but you need to go through their system in terms of which families get in. And I'll explain that a little bit, because really Children's Aid Societies are there to find families for their children, not to find children for the families coming in. So they might have some requirements in terms of, we're only looking at families who will take children age 3 and up. So if you're looking for a 1-year-old, then that's maybe not for you. So you need to call and find out, okay? And perhaps Michael can shed some light on that too, because he is a private practitioner as well. So the portable system. So it is supposed to go, they are supposed to be used, but it is challenging, and it is an issue that everybody is dealing with more and more in terms of, why can't one home study be like another home study? It's one system, one home study, one type of home study, one tool, but different people are using it in different ways. So that can be a challenge sometimes. So the family is considered adopt ready once they've had their home study done, they've done their pride training, they've signed off on it, and now they're looking at children who might be appropriate for them. So there's different ways to look at children who might be available. So through the Children's Aid Society, again through private practitioner, international, which is a different process, which I believe Michael's going to talk a bit about. And then also these are, you can do them simultaneously. You don't have to just pick one. You can actually do them at the same time. You can only do one country, though, at one time. You couldn't do like 3 countries. But you could do one, and you could do one private or a couple private, and you could also do through the Children's Aid Society at the same time. It is challenging, though. It is a big process. It's a lot of work, and it's emotional work. It's not just paperwork. It is emotional work that you're doing as well. So the Pride training really is, it's not a parenting course. It is really to let people know some of the challenges that children in foster care and coming from the international situation or orphanages may encounter. And how as parents, you need to understand that and what that might be like for them. So that's why it's so lengthy. They look at issues such as loss and transitions. They look at openness issues in terms of how you honor birth parents and birth relatives. There's all kinds of things that they look at. They looked at neglect and abuse and preliminary, how that might impact a child over time. They look at how to keep siblings together, why that's important. There's a number of different issues, and that's why it's a lengthy program. And I think many of our families that come to Pride say it's really great, and they wish every parent could go to that. That it was a requirement for every parent. Sometimes they're hesitant coming in saying, why do I have to do this? But once they take it, they say, I'm glad I took it because it has enlightened them on a lot of issues. And then they say, I wish every parent had to take this course. And then often when they become parents, it is a very quick process often. It is a long process for, thank you, a long process for the leading up to being adopt ready. And then when it's actually time to happen, it's a very quick process. As probably my family will let you know, that once it does happen, there's not a lot of time to be waiting around. It's how fast can we get this child into this stable home in a health and safe manner. And so often after that, it could be a little while later, people say, Pride was really good, but it really didn't prepare me for the rest of what parenting was going to be like. So we encourage people to continue to do their own education and their own seeking of information and connecting with other parents. So again, these are the issues that the Pride curriculum covers, 27 hours. So, and you have to take each one. So if you miss it, you have to make it up somehow. So each person is required to do that. So the wife or the husband can't go and say, okay, well, I told him or her about it. They both have to go. So that's a requirement. So again, these are just some of the costs. Again, if you do it through the Children's Aid Society, there is no cost. Sometimes Children's Aid might charge you for photocopying, but many of them don't. It's just built into the system. But for private practitioners, that is their livelihood, and so that's what they do. They would charge a certain amount, and you would take it through there. So this is the adoption home study process, but that just sort of tells you all the stuff you need to do to get ready to do that. There is the 3 avenues, so public, private, and international. So public is the most, that's through the Children's Aid Society, is the most popular. So at any given year throughout the province, there's approximately 800 adoptions. And I just did the stats today because or got the stats the other day because this is the beginning of Adoption Awareness Month in November, which is great. But at this point in time in the province of Ontario, there's 6,300 Crown wards in the province. So that means 6,300 children and youth the province is their parent. And some of those will remain in foster care, but many of those will need homes. So at this point in time, we're only getting 800 of those into permanent families right now. And they do range in age. So yes, there is a big push to have older youth adopted because we have a promotion going on now called the Family Effect. And if you want to look it up on our website, it's a really great short video PSA that talks about what happens to youth when they age out of care. At 18 years old, what are the chances of them being homeless, living on the street, or themselves being having a child who will end up in care. So again, this is the Ontario Children's Aid Societies. They have limited resources to do the home study process. So there will be wait lists in terms of getting in and getting your home study done, or they will prioritize who gets in based on which children they have available and which families are coming in. So they have to make those choices that not everybody who comes is going to get in right away. And they have to make those choices themselves. So many families do go another route, and they will go to private practitioners in hopes of getting things done faster, and then using that through Children's Aid Societies. So you have to really call and look around what might be appropriate for you. So you can, if you go through a Children's Aid Society, you have to go through the Children's Aid in your area. So if you live in Peel, you go through Peel Children's Aid. If you live in Toronto, there's 4 different agencies that you can go to. So there's Toronto, which covers lots of different people. There's the Catholic Children's Aid, the Jewish Child and Family Services, and Native Child and Family Services. So if you're one of those, you go to those 3. And if you're anything else, then you go to Toronto. And that's in Toronto, there's the 4 agencies because it's such a large community. In other jurisdictions, there would just be 1, and everybody would go there. So wherever you live, you have to phone them up and tell them that's where you live, and you would go through that agency. Alrighty. So again, they will decide how to bring families into their system, and that may change over time. So today, an agency would say, okay, we're only looking at families who will take 3 and up. But maybe in 6 months, they will change that, and it will be 1, or it will be 6 and up, or it will be those who would accept children who have drugs and alcohol in utero, who are affected by that. So you need to do your research ahead of time, because when you do call up, they will ask you, are you willing to accept? And then they might go through a list of things. And if you don't know, they will say you need to go and find out if you're willing to accept that. So many people would say, no, I'm not willing to accept a child who has mental health history in the background. But for many of our children, we don't know their backgrounds, or it's unknown to us, or it's undiagnosed, say, for mental health issues. Or we just don't know. We just don't know all the issues for a child or a family when they come into the system. So you need to really look at what is your threshold, and what's your ideal, and what could you manage, and what do you have skills to manage as well? What could you offer a child? Not just the perfect child, but what could you offer any child? Because there is no perfect child, right? Or every child is perfect, maybe. Maybe that's the opposite. Every child is perfect in their own way. So it's what you can bring to the table as well, and what's right for you. You have to also look at your own lifestyle, your own work schedule, your own family life, what will fit for you as well. Sorry, many children's aids will offer an information night so that you would come and learn about some of the children that they have. So you could start there as well. So you often have to complete a whole bunch of paperwork before you even start. So they would ask you to have your police checks done ahead of time. So there's stuff that you would need to do ahead of time before you even get in the door. But it's important to really just phone your children's aid and ask them what the requirements are, so you know what they are. So these are some of the pros of public adoption. So whatever information they have in a child's file, that's what you would be told. That's what you would get. So whatever information they were able to get from the birth family, they would make sure that you got that information, whatever is available to them. There are lots of kids available through that system, and there's a great need for them. The CASs will support families through lots of the decision making, trying to guide them in terms of resources, as well as the transition phase. The workers are really there to help the children settle in and make sure that the families have what they need, or have access to what they need, or understand some of the issues. And then support, sometimes, as I said earlier, there's subsidies for children who might need it, and families who just don't have access to certain things that their children might need. So for public adoption, these are the things that you should be looking at. So willing to consider an older child, probably ages 2. Now, that's not saying that people don't get babies. There are babies. But if you're only looking for a baby, then that might not be the place for you. But if you're willing to look at children or siblings of different ages, then that would be the place for you. I've had families that I've worked with who've, started thinking, well, we'll just have one, and they've ended up with many. So either now or in the future, because often our families that come in the system will have one child now, but if they don't get the support and care and healing that they need, they will have other children, and there will be siblings. And so we've had families where I think the most I've done is one family where there was 9 children, and there was 3 adoptive families. So at any given time, we went to each of those 3 families and said, there's another sibling. And those 3 families were then connected for life because their children are siblings, and they made sure that those siblings were connected as well. So they couldn't all live in one house, I don't think, but that was the next best solution, and it worked out pretty well. So those are the kinds of scenarios that when you're looking at beginning your family, think about what that might look like now, but what that might look like in the future as well. So private adoption, currently there's 90 to 120 private adoptions in Ontario, and that's when the birth parent makes a decision to relinquish their child and to make an adoption plan for them. And so the pros of the private adoption are availability of newborns. So there's usually direct hospital placement. So the child is born, often they are matched with somebody, or the birth parent selects that family ahead of time, and the baby would go home with that family from the hospital. Availability of health and family information, because that process would have happened as well with the birth family. And then the opportunity for the child to have a relationship with his or her birth parents. So this is called openness, what we call openness, and this is really encouraged, especially in private adoptions. That a plan is made, that the 2 families are joined through that child, and that connection is there. It doesn't have to necessarily mean visits every week or anything of that kind. It's whatever works for the 2 families and for the child. Thank you. And then for this, really there is a financial component, because you would need to pay for certain things up front in terms of your home study, in terms of your training, and then in terms of the ongoing work that happens. And what you'd really need to be prepared for is a willingness to work with openness and figure out what that would mean for your family and your child. So there's private adoption agencies, and again, you can look those up through the Ministry of Children and Youth Services, and they have a list of all those people who would do that. And again, there's same paperwork involved. So the best opportunity for placement, is to really spread the word that this is what you're doing, this is what you're interested in. You need to be comfortable with marketing yourself in terms of saying, I am looking to adopt a child. Often that's done through social media, through very many avenues, through friends and family, to let them know. So it's a different, it can feel kind of weird for people, because that's what you're doing. You're letting people know, I'm looking to build my family. And often that's hard for people because it's a private thing usually, right? So again, you can look at your adoption practitioner to guide you through that, and you would need to research your private practitioners too, who you'd be comfortable with too. So international adoption, I'm not going to focus on this too much, but it's approximately 450 Ontario families apply to adopt internationally each year. I'm not sure what the number is of how many come in now, because some countries have really tightened some of those guidelines. So I'm not sure if Michael's going to be able to shed some light on it. They can be costly in terms of The fees involved in terms of travel, there's a lot of work that goes into that, especially legally. And then there's also relative adoption or kinship adoption. So there's grandparents who adopt, there's aunts, uncles, all kinds of people who adopt, and those relatives often go through the same process that everyone else does. If it's a step-parent adoption, that's usually not the same process as a relative adoption. And we do whole seminars on openness, so I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but really it's around honoring birth family. I could sit and talk with you afterwards around how we do that in a respectful way and make sure that that child knows that they have a family or two families that they belong to, one by blood and connections and one through care and attention, and how we make sure that that child receives the best of both worlds and is whole through that and not neglected one over the other. But maybe we'll set up a time to do that another time. So I would encourage everyone to really reach out in different ways to get more information, do a course, go to an information night, call up your children's aid, call up different private practitioners and get as much information as you can. Reach out to us. We have a matching system. Another part of the Adoption Council is we have Adopt Ontario, where we have waiting children across the province who are profiled for adopt-ready families. Once your home stay is completed, you can look at children available across the province who we have available and see if that is a match for you as well. So there's lots of different ways to learn more, so just let us know if we can help in any way. Thank you. You need this? Thanks. Put that down.
Thanks everyone for your patience with me and my technical difficulties. Appreciate it. Thank you, Kimberly, for the amazing presentation there. Very informative. Thank you very much. We're going to take a break now, and we'll be back at 8:50, so around 20 minutes break. So please be back at 8:50 promptly. We'll start again. Thank you.